Hello and welcome to the Arise interview, where we take time to reflect on the big stories from the news and on the fortunes and affairs of the world in an hour of conversation with commentators, analysts and thought leaders. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, as a nervous, sombre, cognitively dissonant Washington prepares to inaugurate a new president of the United States this week, we'll discuss the mood in America and what could be waiting or perhaps lurking beyond the week after the insurrectionist assault on democracy that was incited and set off by President Trump in perhaps his biggest escapade in power. It seems like the US is lurching towards a political catastrophe, with Mr. Trump acting as a sort of tribune of the dispossessed. So what does this mean for the Republican Party, US politics and American democracy? We'll attempt to gallop through that rather big space with my guest today, the former US Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, Ambassador Herman Cohen. Coming up. Now, as you probably know, this week is a big news week in Washington, D.C., as we witness the culmination of a process that'll see Joe Biden inaugurated as the 46th President of the United States. But it's also a political process that's seen another president, Donald Trump, impeached for a second time. And that makes it hugely significant, particularly because in the 244-year history of the United States, it's the first such time. Mr. Trump's second impeachment places him alone in history, not least because it's for inciting insurrection against the country he is the commander-in-chief of. And for a time, it seemed it would not be beyond the realms of the possible that he could be the first to be removed from office just days before his term comes to an end. Well, it didn't happen, but Mr. Trump still faces the prospect of being disbarred from ever standing again. And in the lead up to this week's inauguration, it's left the most powerful democracy on earth battered, bruised and battling with what could be described as an existential crisis. For the first time in many years, what would normally be a peaceful transfer of power has cost lives and has left the Republican Party facing deep tensions and the country itself deeply divided.
Certainly has his work cut out for him. That is a gross understatement. He is probably facing the combination of 1861 and 1933, Lincoln facing secession of states from the Union and an impending civil war, and Franklin Roosevelt facing economic collapse of a worldwide depression.
The levels of threat that are being reported in Washington, D.C. and around the country are of great concern. There's also concern about people not only not accepting the election results, but also not accepting government as an entity that they should be able to respond to. All of those make it very difficult for a new president coming in.
Most Republicans look out at the reality of our 2020 election and know in their hearts that it was legal, that it did not have the type of corruption that the president alleges, and that the president's tirade after the election is based in ego and not in reality. They know this. But despite that, they believe that their political fortunes are better served if they support the president and they support the part of his base that is filled with domestic terrorists and racists.
Now let's go straight away to Washington and speak with Ambassador Herman Cohen, who is a senior member of the Republican Party. Mr. Cohen was the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Africa under George H.W. Bush. He also served as a special assistant to President Ronald Reagan. And during his long career with the U.S. Foreign Service, Mr. Cohen was the U.S. ambassador to several countries. He's my guest today, discussing the lead up to the inauguration of President-elect Joe Biden. Mr. Cohen, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We appreciate the time. You're in Washington, D.C., where it's all happening. How would you characterize the mood there ahead of the inauguration and after the insurrections and the moves to impeach President Trump?
Well, thank you for having me. The mood is quite tense here. You see barriers all over the place. I can not drive my car within 2 kilometers of the capital. There's such a fear of an attack by right-wing extremists. So it is quite tense. President Trump has said publicly that he will support a calm transition. He's finally said that, but he has not accepted that President-elect Biden has actually won the election. So because of that, there are millions of people who believe that President-elect Biden is not legitimate. So there is a great deal of tension in the city of Washington, and I believe throughout the United States.
And Ambassador Cohen, you are yourself, of course, a senior Republican. What do you believe?
Well, I believe that Joe Biden is a legitimate elected president of the United States. President Trump has said there's widespread fraud. Well, for an election in the United States, presidential election, there are at least 50,000 polling stations where people go to vote, or they drop their ballots, or they send in by mail. And there's not a single individual who has come forward to say, I saw fraud. I saw ballots for Trump being thrown away. I've seen Democratic election workers writing in the name of Biden falsely. There's not a single witness who's come forward. And President Trump and his lawyers have gone to court 50 times. And each time judges, many of them appointed by President Trump, have said there's no evidence of any fraud. So it is totally a fabrication. President Trump cannot in his own mind accept the fact that he lost the election. I gather this is a problem of his mental health.
Well, I mean, talking about mental health, presumably President Trump on a personal level is in a very dark place right now. I mean, with senior Republicans such as yourself deserting him, and many talking publicly and volubly about purging him from the party. I wonder if you might reflect on that for us.
Well, most of the Republican leadership, for example, Senator McConnell, who is majority leader in the Senate, normally he would totally support the Republican president. But now he is saying, well, let's have a real discussion after the impeachment to see about President Trump's future. And, if he is convicted after an impeachment in the House of Representatives, there must be a trial in the Senate. His first impeachment, he was acquitted. It's a requirement to have 3/4 of the Senate to find someone guilty, a president, to find a president guilty. And Senator McConnell, who is a very conservative Republican, he is now saying, well, maybe we should have a frank discussion and do what is necessary to prevent President Trump from running again, because he's been such a destructive force. But even now, you do have a significant number of Republican members of Congress who voted to refuse the official count. In other words, they were agreeing with President Trump that there was something wrong with the election. So this is very disturbing within the Republican Party. The Republican Party itself is now split between the people like me who say this was a fair election. Let's face it. He lost and he should go. But there are others who are saying, well, maybe there is something to the argument. Maybe we should take another look at it. So this is disturbing to me as a Republican.
Well, I promise you it's disturbing to a lot of people around the world. But, I mean, is there any aspect of Trumpism that'll live on in the Republican Party, do you think? For instance, Mr. Trump's hybrid of fair trade economic policy coupled with his, national security policy. I mean, is that a new avenue for the Republican Party that if they stick with it, could offer considerable electoral growth for them?
I don't think so. I think the main issue, and it dates back to President Obama. I think there is a cultural issue mainly. When President Obama was elected, there was a segment of the U.S. population, not a majority, that said, are we, the white Protestants, the white Christians of the United States, are we losing power? This used to be a country that belonged to us. But now we see many other ethnic groups gaining power. We see Hispanic-speaking people. We see African Americans. We see people from Asia. And are we becoming a minority in the United States? And a certain segment of people, I would say, people with lower education, who seem to be frightened, people who are in the lower income levels, who are saying, are we losing control of our own country? There's a certain racial angle there, which I don't deny. And President Trump took advantage of that. He sent a message saying, you, my fellow white constituents, you're losing power. And when they saw President Obama was president, they said, oh, God, the other people are taking over. There's a cultural, racial element there that impacts on, I would say, 25% of the American population. And this is something we have to worry about for the immediate future.
Well, I'm inclined to agree with you, although, of course, more than 70 million people voted for Donald Trump, which suggests that it's more than 25%. But what I'm wondering, Ambassador Cohen, is will there be some kind of reckoning for the Republican Party as Joe Biden and the Democrats move into the White House and become the majority in Congress? I mean, is it likely that they'll be made to take responsibility for what they willingly enabled, which is radical groups like QAnon and Proud Boys, dangerous elements that have been allowed to gain a foothold inside the Republican Party?
Yes, this will be a major challenge. I think when President Biden takes over on Wednesday, I think he will immediately reverse some of the decisions that President Trump made, especially with respect to the pandemic. One of the reasons I think President Trump lost the election was the inadequate management of the pandemic. There are far too many people who have died. I mean, the United States proportionately has more deaths per 100,000 population due to the pandemic than any other country in the world, except possibly for Brazil. So this inadequate management, I think, is the first thing that President Biden will need to deal with. And I gather from what I've seen among his advisors that they do have a plan to vaccinate 100 million people in 100 days, and I have confidence they will succeed at that. Now, on the other issues, I think he will make some changes in foreign policy. For example, the agreement with Iran on nuclear, I think that President Trump abandoned. This has caused Iran to move even closer to having a nuclear weapon. So I think he will go back to the original JCPOA agreement and start talking to Iran to stop their progress toward a nuclear weapon. And domestically, I think he will be trying to help the very people who are suffering from the economic effects of the pandemic. He has a stimulus package that would give a substantial amount of money to anyone earning less than $75,000 a year. And this will give these people who are supporting Trump, you might say the lower economic class, this will give them hope that the Democrats are really thinking about their welfare. So I'm optimistic that Biden will bring people together. He will unify the country slowly but surely. And slowly but surely, I think they will forget about President Trump.
Well, we'll have to watch and see, won't we? But just getting you, Ambassador Cohen, to put on your other substantial experiential hat, which is your international ambassadorial role, your contact with so many people across the world, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. I don't know if you think that there's any doubt that the undermining of the legitimacy of the US election and the subsequent storming of the Capitol have severely damaged the perception of the strength of American democracy. I mean, if so, how serious would you say the real damage is to that ideal of American democracy?
I agree that there has been damage. Our image of the country of the best functioning democracy in the world, I think, is definitely damaged. And I hear a lot of my colleagues saying, who are we now to look at African countries, look at the election they just had in Uganda, where the police were arresting opposition and that sort of thing. Who are we to preach to African nations about the quality of their elections? And I think that that's a valid criticism. But I think in general, what happened recently, including the takeover of the Capitol, it showed that basically American democracy is quite strong. You know, these extreme right-wing racist rioters, they didn't succeed. They had to leave the Capitol, and they were very inept people. So in my view, I think it was a demonstration. Maybe a lot of people overseas do not agree with me, but in my view, it was a demonstration that American democracy is really strong and that we defeated these extremist attempts to undermine the democracy. But I agree with you that the image projected overseas is not a good one, and I hope we can recuperate that under Biden as he works to solve these major issues, the major issue of the pandemic, the major issue of the economic fallout from the pandemic, the issue of Iran, getting back dealing with Iran, removing our troops from Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, and getting out of these Middle Eastern wars. I think he will demonstrate that American democracy is still very strong. And while we have these mishaps, it was not the first one, by the way. We've had other, for example, you've had right-wing extremists. About 20 years ago, there was a right-wing extremist who blew up a federal building in Oklahoma City, killing several hundred people. So we have these periodic issues, but overall, we can show that American democracy remains very strong because we overcome these issues as they arise.
Nevertheless, there is clearly, as you've identified, Ambassador Cohen, a threat to American democracy in the form of this sense of alienation and the increasing gulf between the political elite and the public, which is something we see on the right of the political divide and, of course, in the Republican Party, as we've been discussing. But is it also playing out on the left with Bernie Sanders and his followers and a section of the Democratic Party also representing a loss of faith, a loss of trust in the American establishment and the political system?
No, I don't think so. I think the left, you have various elements on the left, people close to Biden who are what I might call slightly left of center, who are very moderate, and even Bernie Sanders, who lives right near me, who represents a constituency right near me. He is not an extreme left-wing person. He is a moderate, but he wants major changes that would, some people would say, are very socialistic. I don't agree with that. For example, he wants a national single-payer health care. Now, health care in the United States, most people get their insurance through their employment. You have a job with an employer, you have your salary, you have various benefits. You have your pension, that sort of thing. And you also have health insurance through your employer. And he purchases it for you, and it's for you and your entire family. Okay, so what happens when you leave your employment? Either you leave it on your own for your own reasons, or your job is eliminated, or you're fired because your employer doesn't like your work. So you're left without health insurance. And hopefully you'll get another job with more health insurance. But this is not an efficient system. It's not a fair system. So Bernie Sanders says, let's have health insurance, US government pay, single payer health insurance for everybody. Now, this is not an extreme view. Now, some Americans will say, oh, we don't want health socialism like they have in England or they have in Europe. We want to maintain private sector health. Well, this is not an extreme view. So I don't see extremism on the left as being a major problem right now. Where I see extremism as a problem is on the extreme right, which has a cultural, racial problem. It's culturally and racial. Remember, I think about a year ago, someone went into a Jewish synagogue in Pittsburgh and killed a dozen people. It's this type of extremism that really worries me.
Well, thank you for that analysis. Let's then look a bit more closely at the Republican Party, of which you are a senior member. I mean, it is fair to say that many leading Republicans, possibly including yourself, didn't want or expect Donald Trump to be their presidential candidate in 2016. How is it that many of them ended up falling in line behind him after he was elected?
Well, he was a very popular personality among the American public because he was a television personality. He had this weekly show where he became known to tens of millions of Americans. He was very popular. And so therefore, when he ran for president, a lot of people knew him and had a favorable view of him. And he did not win the election in the popular vote. We have a system which many people don't quite understand, even Americans don't quite understand, which is the Electoral College, where the winner in each state takes 100% of the electoral votes of that state, which is based on population. So by winning narrowly in certain states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Minnesota, Donald Trump was able to win the election with electoral votes, even though he lost to Hillary Clinton in the popular vote. Now, of course, this is not a brilliant victory, but he immediately started his methodology of telling lies, where he said, well, the people, the reason I did not win in the popular vote were there are several million illegal immigrants who managed to vote. So he started this, and a lot of people believed him. And this goes back to what I said before about the cultural aspect. He was able to play on that, and there's a direct link to President Obama, who was a minority president. I personally thought he was a very effective, very good president, even though he's a Democrat and I'm a Republican. But a lot of people said, oh my, those people are taking over our country. This is when I talk about 15, 20% of people, I'm talking about those people who are vulnerable to racist appeals. And this is what Trump is playing on. Now, you talk about Republicans in the US Congress who went along with President Trump, as they say, they enabled him. They didn't criticize him. In fact, made speeches supporting him. And even now, after the rioting of last week, they're continuing to vote. They're continuing to vote in support of things that Trump has done. And they say, well, they're appealing to his base, to the 70 million people who voted for him. And they don't really mean to undermine American democracy. I believe it, but they are starting to suffer. For example, American politics depend a great deal on contributions from the private sector. And at least from my own count, 25 very big American business corporations who give political contributions have said, we will not contribute money to any of these Republicans who voted against the legal count of the electoral votes. So I think a message is being sent to these Trumpists, people in Trumpists who are trying to take advantage of his political base. A message has been sent to them: you better change and go back to normal, un-Trump politics, or else you're going to lose your support among the main Republican supporters, who are the business community.
Well, stay with us, Ambassador Cohen. Would like to talk with you some more. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, Herman Cohen, about the state of American politics and democracy, with the country preparing to inaugurate Joe Biden as U.S. President. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, this week, as America enters a new political space, my guest today is one who understands that political space more than most, having served 2 U.S. Republican presidents at very senior levels. Herman Cohen is now retired from the U.S. Department of State, but his last position was Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs under President George H.W. Bush. During his 38-year career with the U.S. Foreign Service, Ambassador Cohen served in 5 African countries and twice in France. He was the ambassador to Senegal with dual accreditation to the Gambia. And during assignments in Washington, he also served as special assistant to President Ronald Reagan, as well as the principal deputy assistant secretary for intelligence and research and principal deputy assistant secretary for personnel. Currently, he's the president of Cohen and Woods International, a firm that provides strategic planning services to African and Middle Eastern governments and multinational corporations doing business in Africa and the Middle East. And Ambassador Herman Cohen is still with me from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. An extraordinary career you've had there. I mean, you know, illustrious, serving presidents, serving as ambassador. Just give us a snapshot of what it was like doing all those jobs, as briefly as you can.
Well, it was quite exciting dealing with high levels of government, dealing with presidents of the United States. I don't know how many times I've been in the Oval Office advising presidents. But above all, I was specializing in the underdeveloped world. At university, I wrote a thesis on economic planning, comparison of India and Brazil. And so I volunteered to go to Africa. I say, all of these African countries are becoming independent when I joined the Foreign Service. And I said, this is going to be a great challenge. How can we contribute to their economic development? And so I volunteered to go to Africa, and I was very happy to do that because I was able to make contributions, to make recommendations, and to bring in American experts on various subjects. For example, when I was in Zimbabwe, we had a big program to eliminate sleeping sickness, both among people, human beings, and livestock. and we brought experts in for the Center of Disease Control in Atlanta, and they had a program to eliminate the tsetse fly. So contributing to all of these programs, I also helped a lot on deforestation and various issues like that. So I was quite proud, and also I was able to have access to chiefs of state who were very happy to listen to the American ambassador to talk about problems and how we could cooperate in solving them.
And just staying along the theme of the things that you've done, I mean, how did you get into this line of work? I mean, how did you got out of university and went straight into the Foreign Service, or was there an intervening period?
Well, when I was in the university, the U.S. government still had required military service. It ended with President Nixon. But when I came into the Foreign Service, I mean, when I graduated from the university, I was required to serve 2 years in the U.S. military, like all of my contemporaries. And I had taken special courses at university that allowed me to become an officer. So as I was as you say, a lieutenant in the U.S. Army, I was sent to Germany, where I participated in what was then the occupation. It was the post-war occupation, which ran from 1945 to 1955. And I was there in 1953 toward the end. And I was the leader of an armored platoon. I had four tanks under me, and we were there waiting for the Soviets to invade. You know, in those days, there was a threat that the Soviets might invade West Germany. It was a true. After a few years later, they say, "Oh no, we're not interested in invading. We just want communist parties in France and all these other countries to win elections." But while I was there was a true threat. So we were out on maneuvers at least once a month So this was a very interesting period. So while I was in the Army, I took the examinations for the Foreign Service. I did that because my professor at the university, the City College of New York, encouraged me. He said, you've shown a very strong interest in the international world, and you took some of the most difficult courses that we offer. You took comparative government, European government, you took the theory of international relations. You did very well in all of them. So why don't you take the examinations for diplomatic service and see what happens? You have nothing to lose. So while I was in the Army, I took the examination. It's both written and oral. So while I was in the Army, I passed the I passed the written exam. And then after I left the Army, after 2 years of service, I was called to Washington to take the oral examinations. I was examined by a panel of 3 senior diplomats who were retired already, and they approved, and I was invited to join the Foreign Service, and I accepted.
So that's essentially the path that you took to get into the Foreign Service. But of course, it's one thing to get into it, quite another to move up the ranks. I'm wondering how much your subsequent very senior appointments in the US government was more a move into politics by yourself, or were they simply driven by your career as a diplomat in the Foreign Office?
Well, for the first part of my career, it was mainly career-driven. My supervisors gave me good ratings, and every year there are panels that meet in the State Department that look at all of the diplomats and say, who should be promoted to the next higher grade? And I was quite successful there over the years in moving up rather rapidly. I had a very, very favorable experience when I was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In those days, it was called Zaire. And I started there as a relatively junior political officer. And because of various vacancies, I ended up being, for my last year of a 3-year tour, I ended up being chargé d'affaires. I was the chief of the mission. This was a very, very large embassy, one of our largest in Africa. And I ended up for my last 12 months being in charge of the whole embassy. So this really pushed my career ahead, and I got very big promotions out of that. And it was a question not so much of politics as a question of performance. But after I got back to Washington, I started getting into political levels. And when I was called to serve on the National Security Council under President Reagan, I was his what they call senior director for Africa. And I had to brief him. And I remember he had called me and said, I'm worried about what's going on in Mozambique. You know, you had a civil war going on with Renamo fighting the government of Mozambique. And he said, I think we should support this rebel group, Renamo. And I said, Mr. President, that would be a terrible mistake. Renamo is a very bad organization. They have very bad human rights. They are not friends of the United States. I think we should stay out of that. So he was a very wise man, President Reagan. And he said to me, okay, I'll accept your recommendation, but we should try to make peace in Mozambique. Why don't we go there and try to bring Renamo and the government to negotiate and bring things together? And that was the beginning of the Mozambique peace process. So when he talked to me about this was 1968, and the peace of Mozambique was signed. I'm sorry, not 68, 19. Let me see, I'm getting my dates wrong here. It was 1988. And so we started trying to mediate between Renamo and Mozambique, and President Reagan even invited people to come to Washington to meet with him, to encourage them to make peace. And the peace agreement between Renamo and the Mozambique government was signed in 1992. That was 4 years after we started. So it was in that area, at the political level, when I was on the National Security Council, I was able to advise the President of the United States, and he in turn made decisions that had a major impact on what we were doing in Africa. And later, when I was Assistant Secretary of State under George H.W. Bush, I looked at Africa when I started that job, and I said, look at all these wars going on. There's a bad war in Ethiopia. They're fighting the Eritreans. There are difficult wars going on in Angola and of course, Mozambique. And I proposed to Secretary of State Baker that we should try to get involved and mediate. And he initially was negative. He said he didn't like that. We should get involved in wars that really don't affect the United States. So I was rather disappointed. But a few months later, the president of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, came to visit President Bush. And President Bush said, is there any, they got along very well. And the President Bush said, is there anything we can do to help you? And Gorbachev said, you know, the wars in Angola and Mozambique, Angola and Ethiopia, are costing us a lot of money. We're supporting those governments, and we're sending Soviet military advisors there. And we're spending $1 billion in each country every year, and we need that money in the Soviet Union. Can you help us get out of those wars? So I went back to Baker, and then Baker called me and said, remember your idea of mediating in those wars? Well, now I've changed my mind. Let's go ahead. So at the political levels, all sorts of interesting things happen. And I was very happy to be part of that.
Well, we're very happy indeed that you shared some of those stories with us. I mean, it sounds absolutely fascinating. Obviously, your job to advise, not to compel the presidents, but it's interesting to see how they come around to your point of view. And of course, I mean, I've been watching Designated Survivor with Kiefer Sutherland on Netflix, which gives you a glimpse of what happens in the Oval Office. But most of us have not had that first-hand experience that you've had of actually being in that Oval Office. Tell us about that experience briefly. We've got about a minute before we have to take a break.
Yes, well, it was very interesting because the presidents, they have a tremendous responsibility. So when there are issues that come up with, they're not experts on, and they value the advice of people who are experts. So they're very happy to open the doors and have conversations. And they encouraged us always to be very frank and to tell them what we think, and even to say what the U.S. government may be doing wrong. And I found that George H.W. Bush and President Ronald Reagan love to listen to what we have to say. Of course, President Trump was just the opposite. He thought he knew everything. So that must have been very frustrating. But the presidents that I worked for were very, very interested people and valued good advice.
Stay with us, Ambassador Cohen. We've got another 15 minutes and then we'll let you go. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Africa about the state of American politics and democracy, with the country preparing to inaugurate Joe Biden as U.S. President. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, less than 2 weeks after rioters breached the U.S. Capitol in a deadly attack watched by the whole world, American cities have been preparing for a potential new wave of violent protests, erecting barriers and deploying thousands of National Guard troops. U.S. defense officials say they are concerned about the risk of insider attacks by service members brought in to provide security during Joe Biden's inauguration as president on Wednesday. After the storming of Congress, it's emerged that some of those involved had current or former ties to the U.S. military. And my guest today, Ambassador Herman Cohen, is a senior member of the Republican Party and was the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Africa under George H.W. Bush. He also served as a special assistant to President Ronald Reagan. And Mr. Cohen is still with me from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. And of course, whilst I was talking to you earlier, you also mentioned the fact that you served in the American military. I mean, what does it say to you when you hear concerns being voiced about the possibility that some of the people sent to guard Washington during this inauguration period may well have extreme right sympathies?
Yes, this is a source of worry, and but I'm not too worried about it, because I think the ones who attacked the Capitol the other day did so on the encouragement of President Trump. He said, "Go to the Capitol, walk down the street to the end of Pennsylvania Avenue and attack the Capitol." He said that. And a lot of people said, well, he's our president. He's telling us to do that. And among them, there were several former military, retired military of various ranks. And so now there's a worry. Are there people in the military who believe very much in what President Trump has been saying? So I think it's smart to think about that, but I'm not too worried about that, because President Trump himself has backed off. He said, okay, there's a change of administrations. I support a transfer of power, a smooth, peaceful transfer of power. So I think since President Trump is setting the example now, I'm not too worried that there may be people being brought in for the military to guard the inauguration. I'm not too worried about it, but I think it's wise, because there are always individuals who might think, well, President Biden is not legitimate. I have to do something. I'm not too worried about it. I don't think it'll happen. I think as a former military myself, I think they're all going to follow orders, and they're going to protect Biden. They're not going to attack him.
Of course, there is the vetting process, which is quite extraordinary, taking place of members of the National Guard, which of course is a massive task, given that you've just got literally a few days before Wednesday's inauguration. But what that suggests more than anything else, Ambassador Cohen, is that, whilst, people like yourself who've traveled the world, represented America, and sort of waved the beacon of American democracy around the world, have been talking about radicalization amongst sort of Islamist groups and in, developing countries and so on. There is a sort of radicalization that's been taking place in America and within your Republican Party.
Yes, that's true. We've had radicalization. We've had a number of extreme right-wing attacks over the last 10 years. I mentioned Oklahoma City earlier, where a radicalized young man blew up a building housing federal civil servants. And there's the people who, there was one person who attacked a African-American church. I believe it was in North Carolina, killing a number of people. And then most recently in Pittsburgh, there was a person who killed about 20 Americans at a Jewish synagogue. So it exists. And I think this is a much bigger problem in the United States right now than Islamic terrorism, which we're facing in different parts of the world. But Islamic terrorism in the United States is virtually non-existent, except for the occasional individual who gets off a plane and tries to do something, or that Nigerian fellow who tried to blow up a plane when he was flying. It's true that it's right-wing extremism that is our biggest worry right now. And I'm hope that and of course this was encouraged to a certain extent by President Trump with his taking advantage of racial animosities. I think Biden has the personality and the ability to bring people together. And I'm very optimistic about him as our next president. Even though I am a Republican and he's a Democrat, I know him personally, and I think he's a very good person, and he will bring Americans together.
Well, we can only hope and watch, can't we? But I mean, given all of that, is there a sense that the Republican Party, people like yourself are ready to give it up, given the almost fascist or neo-fascist or pre-fascist path that it appears to be treading now?
It's not to be excluded that the Republican Party could split. And, it's happened before. Before the American Civil War, which began in 1860, the Republican Party was born because the previous Whig Party was split over the issue of slavery. So they couldn't agree on anything. So the party started to disappear and disintegrate. And replacing the Whig Party was the Republicans. And the first Republican candidate in 1856 was a person of French origin named Fremont. He was a former U.S. Army general named Fremont. He lost the election, but because of the great tensions within the party, parties do disappear. So there is some talk now that maybe the Republican Party will split into something else. And as a Republican, I'm quite happy to think about that. Maybe start a new party.
And Mr. Cohen, as the rest of the world watches, what lessons do you think they can learn from what's happened in America, Africa, for instance, where you've done a lot of work? What can they take from what's happened in the US?
Well, I think it's important to make sure that there's no segment of the population that's neglected. Make sure that everyone feels included. If I remember correctly, I don't know my history exactly. I believe that in Nigeria, Boko Haram started in Borno State because there were large numbers of unemployed youth who had only Quranic education. And those who managed to have a regular education and went outside Nigeria, I believe that the governor at the time was a graduate of Oxford. So do not have this vast disparity between a group of elites and people who feel left out. It's very important that every segment of the population feels that they're included and that the leadership is working for them and not for someone else. I always say, what does an African leader do? What does he think about when he wakes up in the morning? Does he say, well, what am I going to do to help my people today? Or does he say, what am I going to do to help my family today? Or to help my ethnic group? So it's very important to think, how are we going to help the people? How are we going to reduce poverty? How are we going to improve schools? I was very impressed the other day when the president of the Democratic Republic of the Congo said, there will now be free primary school education for every child in the Congo. Now, that's the type of thing I like to see. Instead of having to pay the equivalent of, say, $2,000 a year for primary school, it'll be free. And the more that African leadership can do those things and to use revenues for the good of the people, then I'm sure things will go well in Africa.
I have to say that a lot of people in Africa, including those leaders that you talk about, now see America not so much as a model for the rest of the world, but one that's basically extinguished itself in the last 4 years. But beyond that, I mean, is there anything hopeful that's come out of this US 2021 political mess? And we've got about a minute left on the program.
Well, I think the main message is that President Trump tried to destroy American democracy. And he failed. That is the key message. He failed. American democracy is very strong. And he was unable to, despite his appeal to certain people who have racist views, who have extremist views, who feel they're being left out by other people whom they don't consider to be true Americans, people of color, people of different nationalities. Despite all that, he was unable to destroy American democracy. And that is the main message. American democracy remains strong and will get even stronger under President Biden.
Ambassador Herman Cohen, I want to thank you very much indeed for joining us today. You've been an absolutely brilliant guest. Thank you ever so much. Ambassador Cohen, of course, was the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Africa under George H.W. Bush. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja and Washington, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.